In the dying light of the 31st of October, 1917, 800 Australian horsemen crested a ridge in the Palestinian desert and looked down a long, open slope toward a town defended by machine guns, artillery, and an army that had never expected them to be there. Their horses had been without water for nearly 60 hours. Their bayonets had been sharpened 4 days earlier, specifically for this moment. They had no cavalry sabres, because they were not cavalry. They were mounted infantry, armed with rifles slung across their backs and long steel bayonets held in their fists like swords, about to attempt something that every military textbook written in the previous 50 years said was no longer possible. Ask yourself this: had you heard of the charge of Beersheba before today? Most people have not. Most people who consider themselves serious students of the First World War have not. And that absence, that specific gap in what Australia has chosen to remember about its own military history is not an accident. It is a choice. Stay with this story to the end, because what you are about to discover will explain not just how 800 men changed the course of the entire war in the Middle East in 90 minutes, but why a country that produced one of the most decisive victories of the 20th century decided, almost immediately, to look away from it. To understand what happened on that October afternoon, you must first understand the specific kind of failure that made it necessary. By the early months of 1917, the British campaign in the Middle East had stopped. Not paused, not slowed, but stopped against a defensive line that stretched 46 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast at Gaza inland through the desert to an unremarkable town called Beersheba. The line had been there for months. The British had attempted to break it twice, and both times the attempt had produced nothing but casualties and the kind of institutional embarrassment that military headquarters manage by sacking the relevant commander and pretending the plan had been flawed in execution rather than in conception. The First Battle of Gaza, fought on the 26th and 27th of March, 1917, remains one of the more baffling episodes in the entire history of the campaign. Australian and New Zealand mounted troops under Lieutenant General Harry Chauvel had actually penetrated the town. They were inside Gaza. They had forced their way through the defensive positions and reached objectives that the operational plan said would end the battle. Then they were ordered to withdraw. The order came from headquarters, which had been receiving confused reports about fresh Turkish forces approaching, and which made a decision based on information that was either wrong or correctly interpreted in the worst possible way. Chauvel withdrew. Gaza remained Turkish. The town that had been within his grasp would require 2 more full-scale assaults before it finally fell, and those assaults would cost a great many more lives than the withdrawal had saved. The Second Battle of Gaza, fought on the 17th through the 19th of April, was conducted with resources that should have guaranteed success. Tanks, which were then a relatively new weapon and in short supply across every theater of the war, were deployed. Naval gunfire from offshore vessels added to the bombardment. Poison gas was used for the first time in this theater. The result was another failure, more costly than the first and more dispiriting in its implications, because it demonstrated that the Turkish defensive position was not merely stronger than the British had estimated, but had been actively improved between the 2 battles. Every attempt to break it had given the defenders more time to make it better. General Dobell, the commander of Eastern Force, was sacked. His replacement was Lieutenant General Philip Chetwode, a capable British cavalry officer who arrived with a plan already partly formed in his mind, and with the advantage of seeing what 2 costly failures had established: that the western end of the Gaza-Beersheba line was too strong for a frontal assault, that the right end of the line at Beersheba was the place where the entire position was anchored, and that if the anchor could be removed, the position's coherence would dissolve overnight. There was a problem with this elegant analysis. The country to the west and south of Beersheba was waterless, not merely dry in the way that desert country is dry, but genuinely, completely without drinkable water across the entire approach route. Any attacking force would have to carry everything it needed for the approach march and arrive at Beersheba prepared to fight immediately, without the ability to resupply or withdraw and return. The wells of Beersheba were not a prize waiting at the end of the battle. They were the condition of the battle's continuation. Take them intact, and 60,000 men and their animals could drink. Fail to take them, or find them destroyed by a retreating garrison that had been given sufficient warning to do its work, and the attacking force would have to retreat across the desert from which it had come, dying of thirst along the way. There was no middle option, one town, one day, one chance to get it right, in a theater where nothing had gone right for the better part of a year. 5 months of stalemate followed the second failure at Gaza. The same lines, the same ground, the same confidence, hardening month by month, that the problem could be solved by applying the same methods with greater force. It was in this environment that General Sir Edmund Allenby arrived in late June of 1917, took command of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, and did something his predecessors had not. He moved his headquarters from Cairo to Palestine. He walked the ground himself rather than studying it from maps prepared by people who had walked it before him. He looked at what Chetwode had prepared, recognized its essential soundness, and began translating a promising plan into the logistics of a genuine offensive on a scale the theater had not previously attempted. The British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, had demanded Jerusalem before Christmas. Allenby had 5 months and a plan that could deliver it if the first step succeeded. The Beersheba operation was that first step, and nothing that followed was possible without it. The heart of the plan rested on a calculation that was almost elegant in its simplicity. Aerial photographs had confirmed what ground reconnaissance suspected. The trenches on the eastern and southeastern sides of the town were incomplete, shallow in places, and had not been reinforced with barbed wire. The western and southwestern defenses were formidable, the product of months of careful construction by engineers who understood that these were the directions from which the British had previously attacked. The eastern approach was a different matter entirely. If a mounted force could be moved into position from the east without being detected, and could attack with enough speed to reach those unfinished trenches before the defenders had time to organize a coherent response, the town was theoretically vulnerable. The word theoretically carried the full weight of the problem. Getting a force large enough to matter into position east of Beersheba required crossing a desert that had no water on it, at night, in silence, without being detected by reconnaissance or aircraft or the forward pickets that every competent garrison maintained. To execute that gamble, Allenby needed the right man to command the mounted force that would attempt it. Australia had already provided him. Harry Chauvel was born on the 16th of April, 1865, in Tabulum, New South Wales, the son of a grazier whose family had been in the Upper Clarence River District for a generation. He was educated at Sydney Grammar School and then Toowoomba Grammar, and he joined his father's Upper Clarence Light Horse while still managing the family property on the Clarence River. There was nothing in his early biography that marked him as a future general. He was a capable horseman, a methodical organizer, and a man whose apparent shyness struck those meeting him for the first time as aloofness. The assessments of his character left by those who served with him over decades converge on the same portrait. A man profoundly uncomfortable with public attention, fiercely loyal to those around him, and possessed of a tactical intelligence that expressed itself not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient accumulation of things known, and the willingness to act on what the evidence actually showed, rather than what the institution expected him to find. His service moved through the Boer War and then to Gallipoli, where he commanded a section of the line at a moment when the logic of the offensive called for more waves of men to go over the parapet into fire that had already demonstrated it would kill everything sent through it. He refused. He gave the order not to send the next wave, clearly and without hesitation, at a moment when refusing such an order was the kind of thing that ended careers and invited court-martial proceedings. Somehow he got away with that, his grandson said later, with the particular tone of a man who had spent time thinking about exactly why. The first wave had gone forward and died without reaching its objective, and Chauvel had concluded that sending a second wave would produce more deaths and the same result, and he had acted on that conclusion rather than on the institutional expectation that the proper response to failure was more of the same. It was the most consequential decision he made before Palestine, because it established the principle that would guide him through the desert campaigns. That the correct calculation was not how much force was available, but what that force could and could not be asked to accomplish in the conditions that actually existed, rather than the conditions that headquarters believed existed. From Gallipoli, he had taken command of the Anzac Mounted Division and led it through Romani in August of 1916, the first decisive British victory of the entire campaign, in which his troops outfought a Turkish offensive in blazing heat across terrain that favored neither side. Turkish garrisons at Magdaba in December of 1916 and at Rafah shortly after had fallen to operations that required the combination of careful preparation and aggressive execution that defined his emerging style as a commander. Then came the first battle of Gaza, with his forces inside the town and the order to withdraw. What that particular experience deposited in him, the understanding of precisely how far the gap between what is happening on the ground and what headquarters believes is happening can extend, became the foundation of everything he built afterward. He became the first Australian to permanently command a corps on the 2nd of August, 1917, when the Desert Column was reorganized and renamed the Desert Mounted Corps. There had been thought in British headquarters that Allenby might replace him with a British officer, a consideration that reflected the institutional prejudices of an army that had not yet fully absorbed the evidence of what Australian commanders could do when given the resources and the latitude to operate as they understood the situation required. Allenby kept him. The Desert Mounted Corps was now the largest concentration of mounted troops on Earth, and it was commanded by a man who, decades later, his daughter would describe as the type who would have called Beersheba just a military decision at that particular time, and it worked. He was embarrassed by what people made of it, and was never comfortable being the figure that the mythology required. The thing that made the entire offensive viable was not the plan itself, but the homework that made the plan executable. Chauvel studied the records of the Palestine Exploration Fund, the 19th century survey organization that had mapped ancient water sources across the region, and he questioned local Arabs about underground water in the approaches to Beersheba. He found the ancient wells at Asluj, 30 miles south of the town, dry and collapsed, but potentially restorable with sufficient engineering effort. He dispatched engineers with 2 weeks to work on them. They worked. The wells came back to something close to their ancient capacity. It was a piece of research conducted by a commander who understood that the map was not the territory, that the official picture showed a waterless desert, and that the gap between the official picture and what was actually there was worth investigating before concluding that the investigation was unnecessary. Without those wells, the attack on Beersheba was a logistical impossibility, regardless of how sound the tactical concept was. With them, it became the opening move of a campaign that would reach Jerusalem in 39 days. The man who would actually lead the horses over the ridge was not Chauvel. He was a Queensland pastoralist with a civil engineering degree who had bought a station on the Darling Downs and then spent the better part of his adult life learning to fight. William Grant was born on the 30th of September, 1870, in Chauvel, Victoria, the son of a miner who later became a grazier in his own right. He had been educated at Brighton Grammar School, had graduated from the University of Melbourne with a civil engineering degree in 1893, had spent several years in railway construction in New South Wales until his father's death in 1894, and had then purchased Bowenville Station on the Darling Downs in Queensland in 1896, where he ran sheep and cattle and horses on country that required a particular combination of patience and decisiveness from anyone who worked it seriously. His military career began with a commission into the Queensland Mounted Infantry in 1901. He was, by every biographical measure, a civilian who had been persuaded by circumstance and temperament to become a soldier, and who had then discovered, through a series of increasingly serious tests in increasingly serious situations, that he had the particular temperament that serious situations required. Gallipoli had given him the 9th Light Horse after its commanding officer was killed in the fighting for Hill 60 on the 29th of August, 1915, and he held that command through the evacuation and returned to Egypt to rebuild the 11th Light Horse Regiment in early 1916. The Sinai campaign that followed produced a reputation that crystallized in a single phrase from the official record: phenomenal sense of locality and direction. In a raid at Megara in October of that year, he led a column across trackless dune country through fog so thick that navigation by landmarks was impossible, setting his course by calculation and instinct alone, and arriving at his objective at the precise time and from the precise direction he had planned. He received the Distinguished Service Order in December of 1916 for the Sinai operations. He was promoted to temporary brigadier general and given command of the 3rd Light Horse Brigade in August of 1917, then transferred to the 4th Light Horse Brigade in September, a matter of 6 weeks before the date that would make both his name and his brigade permanently famous in Australian military history. He was, in the estimation of every account that attempted to describe him, a man of impetuous temperament. Not careless, because the distinction matters here, but impetuous in the sense that his instinct, when presented with an opportunity, was to commit to it fully and immediately, rather than to hesitate and calculate and qualify. Impetuous commanders find in bold thrusts at the gathering dusk exactly the kind of problem their particular gifts are designed to solve. Grant had spent a military career accumulating the experience to know when boldness was the correct response to a situation, and what was being demanded of him on the afternoon of the 31st of October was precisely that kind of response. The decision to use the brigade in a mounted cavalry-style charge rather than having the men ride to the vicinity of the Ottoman lines and then dismount to fight on foot was Grant's own. Chauvel had ordered him forward, How he went was entirely Grant's judgment. His brigade was built from the same landscape he came from. The 4th Regiment was drawn mainly from Victoria, the 12th from New South Wales, the 11th in reserve partly from Queensland and South Australia. These were not conscripts, and they were not in any meaningful sense professional soldiers. They were volunteers from the land, men who had grown up in saddles, whose relationship with horses was not the relationship of a cavalryman trained in European methods, but the relationship of a stockman with a working partner, whose capabilities and limits were understood through years of direct experience in difficult country. They had ridden enormous distances on difficult ground, in conditions that would have stopped European cavalry units far short of any useful objective, and they had done so without the logistical support that European cavalry doctrines assumed. Their horses were whalers, not a formal breed so much as the practical result of breeding European horses in Australian outback conditions across several generations, selecting consistently for endurance and toughness, and the ability to keep working in heat and dust, and without regular water in ways that would have broken animals bred for the better conditions of European stables. A whaler was 15 to 16 hands, broad through the chest, physically unimpressive by the standards of the show ring, but entirely impressive by the standards of the desert campaign. It had been fighting for 3 years. By the 31st of October, 1917, the horses of Grant's brigade had been without water for between 48 and 60 hours. They were capable of smelling water from considerable distances, and somewhere 2 miles ahead of the ridge they were about to crest there were wells. 136,000 whalers were sent from Australia to the war. What happened to nearly all of them belongs later in this account. On that October afternoon, the relevant fact is simpler than any statistic. They were thirsty, and the wells were ahead, and when horses that thirsty smell water at that range, the decision about whether to charge toward it had already been made by the horses themselves. 4 days earlier, on the 26th of October, Major General Hodgson had ordered the bayonets of the 4th Light Horse Brigade sharpened. The order was practical and was issued without ceremony, and its full significance would only become clear in retrospect to anyone who did not already understand what was being planned. The brigade carried no sabres because it was not cavalry and had never been issued cavalry weapons. If it was going to charge, the bayonet was the only blade available to the men holding it. Someone had understood this 4 days before it was needed, and had taken the practical step of ensuring the weapon was in the best possible condition for what it was about to be asked to do. That understanding, expressed in a single administrative order that would have attracted no particular attention at the time, is what made the charge possible as an armed action rather than a gesture. The deception operation that preceded the battle has accumulated a legend considerably larger than its effect. British intelligence prepared what became known as the haversack ruse in the weeks before the assault. A blood-stained bag containing fake battle plans, personal letters, and documents designed to persuade the Ottoman and German commanders that the real British target was Gaza and that the preparations against Beersheba were a feint intended to draw Turkish reserves eastward. The ruse was executed on the 10th of October by a British officer named Arthur Neat, who staged the apparent accidental loss of the bag to a pursuing Ottoman patrol near the front lines. The credit for conceiving and executing the operation was claimed for decades by Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, a British intelligence officer with a decorated career, and as later and careful investigation established, a lifelong habit of claiming the achievements of others as his own. The actual architect was Lieutenant Colonel James Belgrave, a member of Allenby's general staff. Belgrave was killed in action on the 13th of June, 1918, and never contradicted Meinertzhagen's account because he was dead, and the account did not appear until after the war was over, and Meinertzhagen was free to publish whatever version of events suited his purposes. Whether the ruse accomplished anything meaningful is a question whose honest answer is probably very little. The German commander Kress von Kressenstein doubted the document's authenticity and later said so explicitly. No significant Ottoman reinforcements were moved toward Beersheba in the weeks before the attack. The Turks partly saw through the deception, even if they could not entirely dismiss it. What kept Beersheba lightly defended was not British cleverness in staging a false document, but Ottoman strategic confidence rooted in geography, the entirely reasonable conviction that the waterless desert made a large-scale assault from the east impossible, regardless of what the British intended. That confidence was not wrong as reasoning. It was simply overtaken by wells that no one except Chauvel and his engineers knew had been restored. On the night of the 30th of October, 40,000 men moved toward Beersheba in near total darkness through the Palestinian desert. The orders governing the march reflected a level of operational discipline that the scale of the movement required. Strict light discipline throughout the entire approach. No smoking at any point. Officers stripped of sensitive documents and maps that would be compromising if captured. Bridles and stirrups muffled against the noise that metal makes against metal on the move. Some brigade columns used systems of small lamps set at intervals across the ground, between which the troops marched in the darkness, navigating by the chain of tiny lights rather than by landmarks that could not be seen. The Anzac Mounted Division moved from Asluj, 24 miles south of Beersheba. The Australian Mounted Division moved from Kalasa, 30 miles away. The dust was so thick and so persistent that Corporal Harold Gleason of the 12th Light Horse recorded in his diary a very weary and dusty ride of 30 miles that produced no water at the intermediate stop at Asluj. Private Hunter described the experience with the economy that soldiers bring to descriptions of misery. The dust was terrible, and one could not see beyond his horse's head. 40,000 men and their animals arrived at their positions before dawn, having covered between 24 and 30 miles across desert at night without being detected. When the Ottoman garrison commander Ismet Bey saw, in the first light of the 31st of October, 2 cavalry divisions forming on the ground east of his town where no cavalry had any business being, he was confronting an impossibility that had been made real by wells he did not know had been restored, and by a night march of a scale his defensive preparations had never been designed to prevent. Ismet Bey was not a weak commander, and his men were not poor soldiers. The 3rd Corps he led had defended Gallipoli in 1915 and had demonstrated at that campaign what Turkish infantry could accomplish against a determined offensive by a well-equipped enemy. His problem at Beersheba was architectural rather than personal. His strongest defenses faced west and southwest, where every previous British attack had come from, and where common sense dictated the next one would come from as well. His eastern trenches were shallower, incomplete in sections, and had been built on the assumption that the desert protected them from anything approaching cavalry in force. He was defending against the threat his enemy had previously been capable of mounting. The attack forming on his eastern flank was one his enemy had never previously managed to mount. He was defending against the wrong threat through no failure of his own imagination. At 5 minutes to 6 in the morning of the 31st of October, 1917, more than 100 guns opened against the Ottoman positions to the southwest of Beersheba. The 60th London Division and the 74th Yeomanry Division advanced from the south and southwest through the morning, fighting hard against defenses that had been prepared specifically against this approach and which yielded ground only under sustained pressure and at considerable cost. By midday, the outer positions had been cleared, but the town itself and the wells it contained remained in Ottoman hands. The infantry assault, which would produce 1,151 British casualties across the course of the day, was achieving its designed purpose, pinning the main garrison in place and occupying its attention and reserves, while the mounted divisions moved around the flanks toward the positions from which the decisive blow would be delivered. It was not a comfortable purpose to be fulfilling at that cost, but it was being fulfilled. Tel Saba was the obstacle that most threatened to end the operation before it reached its climax. The small fortified hill 3 kilometers east of Beersheba dominated the eastern approaches to the town and was held by a garrison that refused to yield from dawn despite everything that was brought against it. The Auckland Mounted Rifles of the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade assaulted it in short rushes across open ground that offered no cover of any meaningful kind, sustaining casualties in each rush and reforming for the next one with the kind of steadiness that the official accounts describe in the dry language of the after-action report, and that the men who were there remembered in quite different terms for the rest of their lives. During the assault, the Auckland Mounted Rifles captured Ottoman machine guns from positions they had overrun and turned them against the main redoubt, using the enemy's own firepower against the positions it had been emplaced to defend. Tel Saba fell at 3 in the afternoon, one hill, 3 kilometers east of a town that an empire needed by nightfall. One understrengthed battalion. It held from dawn until 3 in the afternoon, and the German commander acknowledged afterward, without any apparent reservation, that in doing so, it had fulfilled its obligation. With Tel Saba gone, and his last reserve already committed to the southwestern sector in an attempt to hold the positions the British infantry was pressing against, Ismet Bey made the decision that the situation required. At 4 in the afternoon, he ordered the general retirement of the garrison northward toward the Judean hills and the destruction of Beersheba's water wells before the retreating forces left them. His engineers moved to the wells and began preparing the demolition charges that would deny to the approaching enemy the single resource that the entire operation had been designed to capture. At this moment, unknown to Ismet Bey and to the engineers working on the demolition preparations, something was forming 6 kilometers to the southeast of the town that was about to make the timetable of the garrison's retreat irrelevant. German aircraft had been attacking the assembled 4th Light Horse Brigade throughout the afternoon, forcing the formation to disperse across a wide area, as a precaution against the concentrated casualties that massed formations invite from aerial bombing. The aircraft were doing their job effectively, and the dispersion they forced was tactically rational, but it consumed time that the operation was rapidly running out of. It was not until 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon that the brigade had reassembled and was finally in position behind a ridge of rising ground 6 kilometers southeast of Beersheba, with the 4th Regiment formed on the right, the 12th Regiment on the left, and the 11th in reserve behind them. Roughly 90 minutes of usable daylight remained at that point, perhaps slightly less, because the sun was already descending toward the horizon, and the desert light that had been harsh all day was beginning to soften into the particular red-gold quality that precedes darkness in that part of the world. Chauvel's order to Grant, when it came, was brief in the way that the orders of commanders who trust the men receiving them tend to be brief. Put Grant straight at it is how the historical record has preserved it. 4 words. The entire operational significance of the 4th Light Horse Brigade's existence in the war contained in 4 words delivered at the moment they were needed. Grant assembled his regimental commanders and gave his own order to the 12th Light Horse in language that has survived in the record with its complete plainness undisturbed. Men, you are fighting for water. There is no water between this side of Beersheba and Asani. Use your bayonets as swords. I wish you the best of luck. Then they moved. The charge of the 4th Light Horse Brigade at Beersheba on the 31st of October, 1917, began at a trot. The formation was artillery formation. 5 meters between horsemen across a front that stretched far enough that the lines on the left and the lines on the right could barely see each other through the dust that the horses were already beginning to raise from the desert floor. 3 echeloned lines, each behind the last. They rode up to the crest of the ridge, and then the crest fell away beneath them, and the long, gentle slope opened below, and Beersheba was visible in the failing light. And between the men on horseback and the town were the Turkish trenches, and in the town beyond those trenches were the wells, and the Ottoman engineers were already at work on the demolition charges. The Turkish gunners saw them as they crested the ridge and opened immediately with shrapnel. The formation was still at the trot when the first shells burst among the advancing lines. It went to the canter almost at once, and then, as the slope took the horses and the physical reality of descending ground, gave the pace its own momentum that the horses amplified rather than created to the full gallop. The Turkish artillery was accurate enough to find the formation in the dust and the failing light, but not fast enough to track it as the distance closed, at the rate a galloping horse covers ground. The shells began to burst behind the charging lines as the range was lost. The gunners' calculations consistently a second or two behind the actual position of the men they were trying to kill. Ion Idris, a trooper from the 5th Light Horse who observed the charge from a flanking position, wrote 15 years after the event in his book, The Desert Column, that what he witnessed that afternoon had given permanent and specific meaning to a phrase he had previously thought he understood. At a mile distant, their 1,000 hooves were stuttering thunder, coming at a rate that frightened a man. They were galloping through the red haze, knee to knee and horse to horse, the dying sun glinting on bayonet points. Machine guns and rifle fire just roared, but the 4th Brigade galloped on. The image Idris constructed has become the way the charge exists in the memory of everyone who was not there to see it with their own eyes. The machine guns were the real danger, more than the artillery and more than the rifle fire from the Turkish trenches. Rifle fire could be survived if the riflemen's sights were incorrectly calibrated for the range at which the targets were actually moving, and the Ottoman infantry, confronted with cavalry covering 4 kilometers at a pace that had no precedent in their training or their experience of this war, had failed to lower their rifle sights as the distance between them and the charging horses rapidly and inexorably closed. They were shooting over the heads of the charging lines, and by the time they understood what adjustment was needed, the horses were too close for the adjustment to help them. But machine guns, at effective range and properly positioned to cover the approach, would have ended the charge inside its first kilometer, regardless of rifle sights or artillery trajectories. There were machine guns on Hill 1180, positioned to bear on the left flank of the 12th Regiment as it advanced. at a range that multiple contemporary accounts described as coming from a genuinely threatening position that could have proved destructive had it been left to fire without interference. The officers of the Essex Battery acquired those positions, found the range, and silenced them within the first few shells fired against them. The work of seconds, by gunners who had been given exactly this responsibility in the operational planning and who executed it with a precision that the charge's survival depended on entirely. This was not the fortune that afterwards accounts of desperate operations sometimes invoke to explain outcomes that planning and preparation actually produced. This was the combined arms coordination that months of careful preparation had made possible. The two regiments reached the Ottoman trenches and responded to them differently, and the difference between those two responses is what made the capture of the wells possible rather than merely the capture of the town's outer defenses. The 4th Regiment, on the right, jumped the forward trench line and dismounted to fight the Ottoman infantry remaining in the gun pits and redoubts at close quarters with rifle and bayonet, working through each position in the gathering dark with the systematic thoroughness of men who had been doing exactly this kind of fighting in one form or another for 3 years. The 12th Regiment, on the left, did not stop at the trenches. They jumped them entirely and kept riding, found the gaps in the defensive positions that the incomplete construction had left available, crossed the railway embankment that ran through the outskirts of the town, and were inside Beersheba before the garrison's organized withdrawal had gathered enough coherence to mount any effective resistance to their entry. Captured Turkish and German officers said afterward, in accounts that appear in every serious history of the battle, written in the 100 years since, that even at that late stage, with the Australian horsemen a mile out and closing at the rate the gallop produced, they could not believe that mounted troops would attempt what the mounted troops were in the process of completing. The shock was not that the Australians came toward the trenches. The shock was how fast they came, and the consistent failure of every weapon system that should have stopped them to stop them at any point in the 4 kilometers between the ridge and the town. Albert Cotter was 33 years old on the 31st of October, 1917. He had played 21 test matches for Australia between 1904 and 1912, and had been considered by many who faced him across a cricket pitch to be the fastest bowler Australia had produced in the first decade of the century, a man whose slinging action and raw pace made him difficult to face on any surface and genuinely dangerous on surfaces that offered assistance to the bowler. His teammates described him consistently as generous, cheerful, and entirely uninterested in the accumulation of personal recognition that his ability might have justified. His brother John had been killed at Broodseinde in Belgium on the 4th of October, 1917, 27 days before Beersheba. Albert Cotter had been assigned as a stretcher bearer for the charge, a role that reflected the limitations his eyesight imposed and that placed him officially behind the assault line rather than in it. He swapped places with another man because he wanted to be in the charge itself rather than waiting behind it. He was killed dismounting at the end of the charge, shot at close range by a Turkish soldier in the close quarters, fighting that followed the cavalry lines reaching the Ottoman positions. His parents received the notification of his death within a month of receiving the notification of his brother's. The wells were saved by one man following a wire through a town that was still being fought over. Trooper Scotty Bolton traced the demolition wiring that the Ottoman engineers had laid to its source and reached the German officer at the detonation point before the charges could be fired. All but 2 or 3 of Beersheba's 17 wells survived intact because of that single action in the confusion of the assault's final phase. The entire strategy for breaking the Ottoman line for reaching Gaza, for reaching Jerusalem, had been built around the assumption that the wells would be captured before they could be destroyed. It was not an assumption that the operational planning could guarantee. It was an assumption that Bolton made true by following a wire through burning streets while the town was still being cleared. 2 wells were destroyed before he reached the officer at the switchboard. Every other well held. Trooper Thomas O'Leary of the 4th Regiment, operating ahead of his unit in the chaos of the final assault, captured 30 Ottoman soldiers single-handed and then assisted in taking a field gun. He was awarded the military medal for these actions, an award that suggests the threshold for what constituted extraordinary individual behavior on the 31st of October had been set at a level most soldiers would never be called upon to approach. Beersheba fell at approximately 5:30 in the evening. By 10 that night, approximately 58,000 horsemen and 100,000 animals had descended on the town from every direction. They needed 1,800,000 liters of water. The wells the engineers had been ordered to destroy, and which Bolton had prevented from being destroyed, provided it. The horses that had smelled the water from miles away and had galloped toward it with an urgency that no order could have created or suppressed had delivered the campaign to the one result without which nothing else was possible. What the charge had won in 90 minutes took the next 6 weeks to fully understand. Gaza fell on the 7th of November, 1917, 1 week after Beersheba, the fortress city that had resisted 2 major British offensives and spent 8 months being steadily reinforced against further attack, collapsed within a week of its eastern anchor being removed. The position's coherence depended on Beersheba holding the line. With Beersheba gone, Gaza had no flanking protection and no strategic logic to its continued defense. The Ottoman forces retreated northward, and the British followed with a momentum that the previous 5 months of stalemate had made seem permanently unachievable. Jerusalem surrendered on the 9th of December, 1917, 39 days after the charge at Beersheba. Allenby entered the city on foot, refusing to ride in on horseback. The Kaiser had entered Jerusalem on a white horse in 1898 as a statement of imperial arrival, and the contrast Allenby created by walking was deliberate and understood by everyone who observed it. 400 years of Ottoman rule in Palestine had ended. The Megiddo campaign of September 1918 completed what Beersheba had begun. Chauvel's corps covered 167 kilometers in 3 days, took 70,000 prisoners, and destroyed 3 Ottoman armies in the field in one of the fastest military pursuits in the history of mounted warfare. The doctrine that the Palestine campaign had built and demonstrated, that speed and the exploitation of a specific breach could accomplish what firepower and frontal assault could not, had been proven at every level from the tactical to the operational to the strategic. The horses did not come home. The War Office decision was practical, and from the perspective of the men who had ridden those animals through 3 years of desert fighting, an act of administrative convenience so casually executed that it has never been entirely forgiven by the men who were present for it, or by the families of those men who heard about it afterward. Returning the whalers to Australia would cost more than the horses were worth in any financial accounting. Quarantine restrictions provided an additional rationale. The younger and fitter animals were transferred to the British Army as remounts and to Indian cavalry units for post-war occupation duties in the territories the campaign had just conquered. The older horses, those over 12 years of age, were examined by veterinary officers, classified as unfit for continued service, and destroyed by the same systematic process that military administration applies to any equipment that has exceeded its useful life. Their manes were shorn before the shooting because horsehair had commercial value. Their shoes were removed because iron had commercial value. Then they were shot in groups near their camps in the early months of 1919, and the hides of those shot were salted because hides also had value, and the records note this sequence of events in the same impersonal register in which military records note the disposal of any surplus materiel. Behind that impersonality was something that the records do not describe at all: what it was like to be the man holding the rope. Major Oliver Hogue, a light horse officer who published under the pen name Trooper Blue Gum, gave words to what the men who had ridden those horses through the Sinai and Palestine campaigns were carrying. He wrote that he would rather shoot his horse and tell a small, comfortable lie about how it had died than return to Australia and leave his horse behind to a life of hard work under strangers in a country that was not its own. The decision to shoot service horses was illegal, and the impulse that produced it was, by any human measure, the correct response to an impossible situation. Hogue died of Spanish flu in 1919, the same year he wrote the poem. He did not leave his horse behind because he did not go home either. The one exception was a horse named Sandy, brought back to Australia on the dying wish of Major General Sir William Bridges, who had commanded the 1st Australian Division at Gallipoli and been killed by a sniper's bullet. His wish that Sandy be repatriated was granted by the authorities who might otherwise have processed the horse through the same system that disposed of all the others. Sandy was shipped from Liverpool in 1918 and spent his remaining years at the Remount Centre at Maribyrnong in Victoria. He was the only Waller that came home from the war. 136,000 had gone. The ratio is not a figure of speech. It is a record of what happened. The men who had made the campaign came back to a country that was already, in the months immediately after the war ended, building its memory of what the conflict had meant around a story that had nothing to do with Palestine. The story it was building was about Gallipoli, and the reasons for that choice illuminate something about the psychology of national identity that the military history alone cannot explain. Gallipoli was a British-led campaign that failed at every strategic level and produced 8,000 Australian dead. Beersheba was an Australian-led campaign that succeeded and produced 31 Australian dead in its most famous action. One entered the national calendar permanently. The other required a centenary commemoration before most Australians had occasion to hear of it. This is not a conspiracy, and it is not an accident. It is a preference, and preferences reveal what a community values more than any formal declaration could. The structural reasons exist and can be named plainly. CEW. Bean's official history, which shaped Australian understanding of the war for a generation, centered the Western Front and Gallipoli, and treated Palestine as a secondary theater whose significance was military rather than national. The Western Front's industrial scale of killing made every other theater of the war appear, by comparison, peripheral, which it was in terms of casualties, but not in terms of strategic consequence. The emotional architecture of shared sacrifice serves different purposes in the construction of national identity than the emotional architecture of shared victory. Grief creates solidarity in ways that triumph does not. And the Gallipoli story offered grief of a particular purity. Young men sent to a difficult place by other people's decisions, performing with extraordinary courage in a campaign that failed through no fault of theirs. It was a story about what Australians were rather than about what they had accomplished, and that distinction mattered to a young nation constructing its sense of itself. The myths that accumulated around Beersheba belong alongside this larger pattern of selective memory and belong to the same human instinct that created it. The famous photograph known as Thunder of a Light Horse Charge has been reproduced as the definitive image of the charge for more than a century, and is almost certainly not a photograph of the charge at all. The terrain visible in the image contradicts the written accounts of the charge, which describe the approach as running down a long, gentle slope toward the town, while the photograph shows ground that is flat or slightly uphill. There is no evidence of shell fire in the image, despite the artillery fire that all contemporary accounts describe as continuous during the advance. Close examination of the image reveals what appeared to be stationary riders in the second line of the formation, which would have been impossible at any point during an actual charge at full gallop. Brigadier General Grant declined to accept the criticism when the photograph was displayed at an exhibition in 1920 and insisted that he could not and would not challenge the claim that it depicted the actual charge. His defense of it settled nothing. 100 years of examination by people with access to better analytical tools than Grant had in 1920 has not produced a definitive answer. And the most iconic image of the most famous charge in Australian military history remains, in all probability, a staged recreation whose subjects are unknown. The haversack ruse reveals the same instinct operating at a smaller scale. A deception operation was planned, and a bag was dropped, and the documents were recovered by Ottoman forces, and the German commander doubted them and said so. And no reinforcements were moved, and Beersheba fell anyway for reasons that had nothing to do with what was in the bag. Richard Meinertzhagen claimed credit for both conceiving and executing the operation, and published that claim in diaries that appeared after the man who could have contradicted it was dead. He was subsequently found to have stolen museum specimens and claimed them as his own discoveries, which established a pattern that cast his other claims in a different light without definitively disproving any specific one. The deception that became legendary, the blood-stained bag with the fictional officer's love letters, was probably irrelevant to the outcome it is credited with producing. What was not irrelevant was the restoration of the Asluj wells by engineers working on information that a general had found in 19th century survey records. That piece of preparation made the attack possible. It does not appear in popular accounts of the battle, because it does not make a good story. A man on a horse dropping a bag near enemy lines makes a good story. A general in a library reading Victorian survey maps does not. This is how military history is distorted, and how the things that actually determined outcomes are displaced by the things that make better copy. What Beersheba actually demonstrated, separated from everything that has been added to it in the century since, was a set of principles that became the foundation of mobile warfare doctrine across the remainder of the 20th century and into the present. Speed as a tactical asset that protects attacking forces by denying defending forces the time to bring their weapons to bear effectively. Combined arms coordination that assigns specific suppression tasks to specific weapon systems and executes them within seconds of the need arising. The intelligent exploitation of a single piece of accurate intelligence, in this case the absence of barbed wire on the eastern trenches, through a form of attack that the defending force had not built its position to resist. Preparation so thorough that what looks like improvisation in the moment is actually the execution of a plan whose every contingency had been accounted for in advance. These principles did not originate at Beersheba. What Beersheba did was demonstrate them at scale in a decisive engagement, whose results were visible to anyone who studied the subsequent campaign. And the commanders who studied the Palestine campaign took what it had proven into every mobile operation that followed. Harry Chauvel retired in 1930 and asked to ride every day. A horse was brought to his house in South Yarra by a groom every morning, and he rode it through the streets of the suburb. And on the days when illness prevented him from riding, the horse arrived at the arranged time, and he sent down an explanation. He died in Melbourne on the 4th of March, 1945, and was given a state funeral at which the Prime Minister John Curtin described him as one of the foremost military minds of his generation. His nephew Charles had made the film 40,000 Horsemen in 1940, built partly from his uncle's letters home from the campaign, and Harry Chauvel was reported by his family to have been entirely embarrassed by what the film made of the events he had planned and commanded. His daughter said he would have described Beersheba, if pressed, as just a military decision at that particular time, and it worked. He was never comfortable being the figure that the mythology required, and the mythology required a figure he was not. The cemetery at Beersheba holds 31 graves marked with the Australian emblem. They belong to men who rode over a ridge in the last light of an October afternoon and did something the military textbooks of their era said was finished, in the service of a campaign that delivered Jerusalem in 39 days and broke the Ottoman Empire's hold on Palestine permanently. They did it because they were out of water and their horses could smell the wells, and a general they trusted had ordered them forward, and a brigade commander they respected had told them what the order meant, and they were men from the land who understood, without needing it explained to them, the difference between having water and not having it. They did not change the outcome of the war by themselves. No single action could have done that in October of 1917. What they did was demonstrate, in conditions that left no room for comfortable interpretation of what the evidence showed, that the capabilities the military establishment had decided were obsolete were available to anyone disciplined enough to develop them, and patient enough to prepare for the moment they were needed and willing to commit to them without hesitation when that moment arrived. The methods that seemed like a return to an earlier and less sophisticated era of warfare were not a return. They were the future. The men who built them are gone. The future they built is still operating. The flag that flew over Beersheba on the morning of the 31st of October, 1917, came down that evening. The men who took it down are mostly gone now, quiet in cemeteries in Israel and Australia and the places in between. They did not make it into the history textbooks the way that the Western Front did, or Gallipoli, or the campaigns that absorbed the attention of the nations that fought the war and then chose which parts of it to remember. They made it into the doctrine instead, and the doctrine shapes every mobile military force operating anywhere on Earth today. And there is an argument to be made about which form of permanence lasts longer, and the men who earned both without being given either deserve to have that argument made on their behalf. Now you know. Tell me in the comments whether you had heard of the charge of Beersheba before today. Because the men in that cemetery and the horses that never came home deserve at minimum that someone is still paying attention.